Hello everybody, I'm back from the grave with a new video. This one is a sequel to the Minimap video I made over a year ago. This one will extend it to show you how to make a minimap that's in the style of a Super Metroid minimap, with its grid-like movements and whatnot. This episode is dedicated to friend of the show, Jones Baruki2, who I've been having a discussion with in the comment section of the Minimap video, who's trying to implement a Metroid style or Zelda style minimap. And I've been trying to help him in the comments, but the complexity of what needs to be done in order to get it to work 100% correctly kind of warranted the need to make a whole video about it. So here it is, let's get started. Before we begin, you're going to make sure you have your minimap all set up. I have here a single large sprite that I'm going to be using as the background blip for my whole map. You're going to want to make sure you have set the width and height of that sprite to be correct. In my case, the plane that this blip represents is 40 in-game units wide by 40 in-game units long. So I have set the width and height of the blip in the minimap hierarchy to 40 and 40. If your background's made up of multiple mini blips, then you got to make sure each blip's width and height is set to whatever the in-game dimensions of whatever it's representing is. So a problem here is we have a minimap that is too fluid. Everything moves around smoothly inside of it, and we need to restrict the movement into a sort of grid-like pattern. So if you have a blip in this location, and we want it to be constrained to a grid like this, we want it to be moved into the center of a cell, just like that. In order to do this, we're going to need to know a few things. We're going to need to know how wide our grid is, and we're going to need to know the number of columns that we want inside of the grid, so we can calculate how wide each column should be. And we're also going to need to know an offset for each blip, because the way the UI works is everything's center aligned. So if we were just to constrain the location of the blip just raw, then it would be centered around where the grid lines intersect instead of inside the center of the cells, which could be, what you want, but in our case we actually want our blips to be in the centers of the cells instead of on the intersects. So to begin, go ahead and open up minimap.cs. We're going to add a few member variables to the class. Our first one will be width, the total width of our grid. I already know mine's 40, so I'm going to just assign it to 40 there, but you can change it in the inspector. We're going to have a boolean is segmented, so we can toggle on and off whether or not we want our minimap to be segmented in a grid into a grid. So, this isn't a permanent change to the minimap class. You can choose whether or not you want it on there or not. The number of segments, I know ahead of time that texture I'm using is 16 squares by 16 squares, so I know I need 16 columns. So we're going to need to create a new function to help us out in our endeavors. This one's going to be called round position, and what it'll do is it'll take a position that'll be in any arbitrary space, and it'll constrain its x and z values to align with those of our grid. So first we got to calculate the segment width, which is going to be the width of the columns of our grid. And then in order to constrain the x and z values, what we do is we take each individual value, we divide it by the segment width, and then we round it down or up. In this case, they could actually both be math.floor. I choose ceiling for some reason. I just like to make things difficult. But they could both be math.floor. So we round them down, and then we multiply them again by the segment width. And this is a quick and easy way to round a value to a certain multiple. In this case, we're rounding like position x and position z to multiples of segment width. And then we return it. So now we have to modify our transform position function. Here we are going to mess with our offset calculation so that we can constrain that offset to our grid. So we're going to modify that by saying, if is segmented is true. So if we want a segmented minimap, our offset is going to be calculated by rounding the position of the position passed to us, subtracting the rounded position of our target's position, and then adding our nudge value in case it needs to be just pushed over a couple more pixels in a certain direction. And then else we'll use our old offset calculation. Alright, so let's move on over to our blip file. Here we're going to add our little offset that each blip might need in order to fit exactly inside of our grid. So we're going to add our float, segment offset, and we're going to pass it then to our map.transform function. Here I use negative segment offset, 0, and then segment offset as my values. If you changed that function earlier to both use floors instead of position.x needing ceiling, here you can just use both positive segment offsets. That's probably the best way to do it. I don't know why I did it this way when I was recording. Again, I just love making things horribly complicated for no reason. So that's all you need. That's all the code changes in order to get a grid-like minimap. So here to wire it up, I'm going to show you. Here's our minimap with the game running. I run around, everything's nice and smooth. Nice and smooth. The minimap's current target is the plane's blip, so everything's pretty much stationary. When I set it to segmented, now you can see all my blips are aligned at the intersections of the grid, which is not exactly what we want. So in order to fix that, I'm going to change the blue blips offset. So I'm going to go up into this upper left-hand corner so I know I'm all aligned correctly. And I'm going to change the segment offset value on the blue blip. I'm going to slowly drag it up, and you can see it slide right into place. And it seems to be the correct value at 1.2. Is a good offset. I can also change it for the red blip as well, since they're the same size. And now you can see me running around. I'm inside the grid, right in the center. I can push the red cube around, and he's also in the minimap in the correct position. So everything's working pretty great. But the Zelda minimaps and the Metroid minimaps, their maps aren't stationary, and if the blue blip was our player, the minimap would actually be targeting our blue cube instead of the background. So you'll notice when we change, so if you change the target to the blue cube, everything still works perfectly fine. Everything's great. I don't know if you'd want to, but if you wanted to be able to rotate the map, I have lock rotation checked. When you uncheck mark it, you'll see that rotation still works. Nothing's broke really. There's a little weirdness on the fact that the blue blip is not the center of the rotation. As you can see here, the blue blip's kind of like off center. And the way you can fix that is if we change the segment offsets of the blips to be 0. So now you can see they're aligned again on the intersections, and I'll move over here into the corner so I can make sure everything works correctly. And instead, I'll change the segment offset negative for the map. So I'll shift the map over instead of each individual blip, which is probably easier to do than doing it the other way. So now with that, now when I turn, the rotation of the minimap is now centered correctly on the blue blip, and it doesn't look so weird. And I can still push around the red cube and it still works. So that's all you need to do to get a nice segmented mini-map. Of course, for Zelda style games and Metroid style games, you're going to have more than one background object, and this supports it. If I had like multiple checkered planes next to each other, they can all exist and they'll show up right next to each other on the grid, and they'll They'll all be segmented correctly. Normally you'll probably have much fewer columns than I do, and they'll probably have much smaller columns, but it should work. You'll be able to figure it out or shoehorn something in. If it doesn't work out, then you're probably just going to need to scrap this whole system and roll your own, because a Metroid style minimap or a Zelda style minimap, it doesn't require all of the functionality that this minimap provides. This provides a little too much. All you really need is, just show a texture and then blink at whatever position or room the player happens to be in. So it doesn't require, the constant updating of blips and rotations and offsets and all that stuff. So it might be easier, if this doesn't work out 100%, to just roll your own, like a simple data structure or some sort of, texture fill-in thing. I'm sure you can figure it out. But yeah, if this doesn't help, feel free to leave a message in the comments. I'll try and help out as best as I can. So thanks again for joining me in this video. See ya.